लेक्चर सीरीज का नाम बजह बेबजह। आज हॉल में बिहार से कितने बच्चे हैं? किस कवित्री की मैं बात कर रहा हूं? वो लिखती हैं बजह बेबजह मुस्कुराना होगा, बजह बेबजह मुस्कुराना होगा, मैं खुश हूं ये सबको दिखाना होगा।
As you know that though it's a civil services preparation class, but I could have never disassociated myself from the love for academics. So every year we always try that you get this level of insight also. We have been consistently inviting the other professors too. Professor Happy Mon Jacob was here and others too. So now today, sir, and I think very interesting topic. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
And they are just starters actually. Our newest batch, they have not actually studied much, but I think everybody is aware of India, China. So yes, the stage is yours, sir. And just
Thank you, Shubhra ji, and I suppose everyone can hear me.
Is it audible on you?
Am I audible to the last row people? Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. I think first of all I wish to sincerely congratulate Shubhra ji. As far as I know, for one more time she has her personal student being number one in the list of civil service this year. This academy also, other than only claiming number one, usually has large number of selection. Every year I am told 102 for this year, which is an extremely impressive achievement for any institution. And I am therefore lucky and feel happy to be part of initiatives that Shubhra ji takes. Satya Prakash is always in touch with me. First thing I should say here is let it not be a monologue from my side. At any stage, even if one of you wishes to say something, feel free. Just raise your hand. If I am not able to see your hand, just stand up and raise your voice. The idea here is that we are spending about an hour and a half together. You should definitely have a sense of having had some takeaway, having learned something from this discussion. सबसे पहले तो लेक्चर सीरीज का नाम बजह बेबजह। आज हॉल में बिहार से कितने बच्चे हैं? अच्छा नहीं आप लोग डोमिनेट करते हैं, मुझे मालूम है। अच्छा, मैं एक और सिलेक्शन करूंगा। सीवान जिला से कितने हैं? एक देश की जानी मानी कवित्री हैं, आपने नाम सुना है उनका? किस कवित्री की मैं बात कर रहा हूं? आलोक। दूसरा नाम बताइए। बजह बेबजह से मुझे याद आया कि उन्होंने एक बहुत अच्छी कविता लिखी हुई है, बजह बेबजह। वो लिखती हैं बजह बेबजह मुस्कुराना होगा, बजह बेबजह मुस्कुराना होगा, मैं खुश हूं ये सबको दिखाना होगा। Those of you who missed it because we are speaking in Hindi, for no rhyme or reason, you should have a smile on your face, which also means keep your chin up and spirits high, because you will need that to contest civil services examination. And I think that also to some extent explains the subject we are discussing. Perception management is very significant for any rising powers like China and India. They have to be seen as successful, prosperous, innovative, powerful, influential. So कभी कभी देश भी बजाय बेवजह मुस्कुराते हुए नजर आते हैं और दुनिया में अब भारत सबसे बड़ी जनसंख्या वाला देश है. Sometimes I broadly, like an academic, I say 19th century is the time when in international relations we had to devise a term great powers. Because we had empires before that, but there was no expression of nation states being described as great power. Now, great powers was an outcome of steam engines and therefore fleets, naval fleets, which made it possible for European small states to go around the world and colonize the world. So they became great powers, driven by discovery of steam engine, naval fleets, colonies. Then we reached 20th century, we heard another term called superpowers. Now great powers were powers that could influence events around the world. And now superpowers that could influence events around the world, multiple places simultaneously. And the key behind becoming superpower at that time was primarily nuclear revolution. States that had nuclear weapons were described, Russia, Soviet Union then and now Russia, and United States as superpowers. And that was driven by the key of nuclear energy. Actually, nuclear revolution was often much bigger imagination than what we achieved, because nuclear revolution was to transform every aspect of life. Like in ice age, everything was around ice. Copper age, anyone who had copper was supreme. In nuclear age, everything around life should have moved by nuclear science and technology, but it couldn't happen because the first thing in Second World War that pushed everyone to work on nuclear science was to build a bomb, build a weapon, and therefore it got extremely nationalized. So unlike sciences that were sharing knowledge around the world, intellectuals will speak to each other around the world, nuclear science became completely dominated by nation states, bureaucracies and establishments, and therefore sharing was not possible. What it means is that actual impact of nuclear revolution could not be achieved. It did not change our everyday life. For example, we will not have nuclear energy crisis if we were allowing nuclear technology to be shared freely. But why I am talking of steam engines and jumping to nuclear revolution? Because in 21st century, the key to success, influence, prosperity is people. People's power is 21st century key to success. And who has people? China and India have a lot of people. In fact, the country which is next largest, United States, is 1/4 of the size of either China or India. And therefore you see, all international organizations, all multinational corporations are increasingly being headed and controlled by Chinese and Indians. World Bank, for example, was always a US citizen, even now US citizen, but it's an ethnic origin, Indian ethnic person, who's now heading the World Bank. So people's power is going to be really the future, and that again makes China and India very significant, because these are two countries that have large number of manpower. And you have to empower that manpower with education, skill development. तो शिक्षा और कार्य कौशल से यदि हम उनको तैयार करते हैं तो जनसंख्या आपका जो है वो एसेट हो जाता है, और वो हो रहा है दोनों देशों में, चीन में और भारत में. Why I am bringing you here is to explain to you why contestation between China and India is inevitable. Because they are two extremely rapidly rising societies. Don't even look at them as nation states, because nations do not control what populations are capable of doing. Populations are transforming life the way we have understood around the world. I am talking of populations of China and India. So even when the Chinese and Indian leaders over a period of time understood that they are on a trajectory where they need not get diverted into conflicts with each other, that means they understood how to manage their what we call historical and bilateral problems. They have moved into an entirely new situation where they are now having a much larger, intense and regular interface at regional and global levels. They learned how to manage bilateral issues, historical claims, and that was called a new chapter of maintaining peace and tranquility on the border. In 1988 December, Rajiv Gandhi had visited China, which is when this foundation of a new chapter called maintaining peace and tranquility on the border, meaning that we have differences, but let's first agree on areas where we can agree, we create an environment where then we can deal with difficult issues. So they managed that chapter of maintaining peace and tranquility of last 30 years. But in 30 years, both the countries have transformed completely. They are not the same as they were. To give you very simple statistics to understand the difference, in 1990, when they started this new chapter, India's GDP was around $297 billion and China's about $312 billion. So both roughly around $300 billion. You are in civil services, you are much better at statistics than I can be. Today Chinese are claiming to have 18 trillion, they call it 100 trillion, 1000 trillion yuan or something like that. But in English, measurement, $18 trillion economy. China today is $18 trillion economy. India is about 3.5 trillion. So India has also grown 10 times compared to 300 billion to 3.5 trillion. But Chinese have really moved much faster ahead. And when you have more money in your pockets, then you do things that you always wanted to do, right? For example, you wanted to buy more fancier automobile, Royal Enfield or something, you will go and buy it because you have money in your pocket. Nations also have dreams and ambitions. And incidentally, both China and India are also continuing ancient civilizations. So they have enormous amount of, whether you call it baggage or you call it an asset, they do have knowledge, traditions. Sometimes they become baggage. For example, if your parents tell you never to smoke, then you maybe misfit in a particular group which likes smoking, right? So it could also be a limitation, it could also be an asset, depends on where you are and how you interpret things. But fundamentally, both these are continuing civilizations and have had their own imaginations as to who they are. Chinese consider themselves as middle kingdom. They were the center of the universe. और महाभारत में हमें भी लगता था कि हम ही विश्व हैं. We were also Vishwa Guru in that sense. We are trying to come back and become Vishwa Guru. And therefore, when they have resources, leverages, skilled manpower, they want to achieve things that they always wanted to achieve, including their claims on territories. So they had imaginations of what territory is part of us. And both had frontiers that connected them. Some of you may have heard the expression Indochina. Indochina, 3 countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. Now that is where these two Sinic and Indic civilizations met each other. And the fusion became Indo-China region. Sometimes by mistake people end up writing Indo-China for India-China, but that's a different region altogether. So here you have to write either India, China or Sino-India or something like that. So that kind of infusion in that region shows that they had their influence all the way beyond what are their current borders. India's influence is throughout Southeast Asia. You go to Thailand, you go to Cambodia, Vietnam, you see so much similarity in language, in names, in rituals, in traditions, in dress, in food. Likewise, the scenic world also, the whole Koreas, Japan, Vietnam. Now, they were not necessarily seen as nation states in ancient times, but they had a sense of what, in a crude fashion, you could call vassal states, subject territories. And in Chinese case, for example, emperor was son of heaven in the center, and then they were civilized subjects and they were barbarians beyond that. That was the imagination, that those who are not in Chinese control are not civilized. It's nothing strange. Europeans had the same feeling towards us. You know, most societies think that we are the smartest until they meet someone who's smarter than them. Therefore, when they are now becoming capable, they are trying to achieve things which they always wanted to achieve, meaning more influence, more leadership. Some of that contest also was visible in 1950s, 60s when both became independent. China got liberation, India became independent, but then they drifted into different sides. India came closer to Soviet Union, China became closer to United States, etc. But they were not still as developed as they are now. So, though they were ambitious in 1950s to become model Asian leader, मंशा थी, हैसियत नहीं थी. आज मंशा भी है, हैसियत भी है, तो कंटेस्ट इसलिए भी है. और बायलैटरल इश्यूज को ठंडे बस्ते में डाल दिया, पीस एंड ट्रैंक्विलिटी वाले में, पर अब ये रीजनल और ग्लोबल लेवल पर नई नई मुद्दे हैं. देयर आर न्यू इश्यूज दैट दे आर डीलिंग विद. Climate change is a new issue. Terrorism is a new issue. World Trade Organization has several dispute mechanisms, how they should be managed, who should be sitting on what office. United Nations, for example, has 15 agencies. Who should be chairing those agencies? It has 6 organs. Who should be dominating those organs? WHO का debate आपने सुना होगा. Either Chinese are directly controlling it or indirectly controlling it. China's influence in elections around the world, for example, in Australia, in United States, in Canada, are in debate. So countries are now facing issues that they were not facing before. For instance, you may have heard China-India trade has increased suddenly. China-India trade, I think the last count was 125 billion US dollars. In fact, it was rising during the tension time. When there were border tensions, there was pandemic, everybody thought no trade will happen. China-India trade was rising by 43% for that year. Now it's good news, but it's also bad news. Bad news because it has become virtually one-sided. China exports 90%, we export 10%. और एक तरफा दोस्ती तो बढ़ती नहीं है. I think young people understand when I say this. When you have one-sided trade, where will you go? You can't take it too far, right? So that deficit is a huge problem for about almost 18, 19 years now. But other than that, when you have suddenly increased economic relationship, there are added irritants that never existed before. For example, India could suddenly think of tightening the quality controls of imports. India could start regulating China's investments into e-commerce. Most of you must have suffered TikTok being banned in India. Now, if there was no TikTok in India, there is no banning of TikTok. So there are issues, what I am saying, that have cropped up afresh that were not before. Now China and India trying to influence Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries, for example. India has a look east, then an act east policy. Thank you. China also wants to engage that region. You are reading about something called Indo-Pacific geopolitics, where Indo sounds like good music to us. Now it is Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. It has nothing to do with India. But there are new things in geoeconomics, geopolitics that make China and India have an interface. I remember way back when Dr. Manmohan Singh was India's Prime Minister in 2015 or so, April 2015, when Xiaopo had come, Chinese Premier had come here. And he had said that though we are meeting after a long period of 5 years in bilateral mode, they had met bilaterally 20 times. They had met multilaterally. So these leaders are meeting, Chinese and Indian leaders, for example, are meeting in July. There is a SCO summit. Then in August, there is a BRICS summit. Then in September, there is G20 summit. These are not bilateral meetings. They have nothing to do with bilateral. So they meet so regularly in other contexts, in other forums dealing with other issues on which sometimes they have similar vision, similar ideas, similar assessment, similar strategies. Sometimes they do not have similar strategies and similar assessments. Now, if these were two small $300 billion economies sitting at their home not doing much, that interface will not happen. So when I started by saying बजे बेवजह मुस्कुराना होगा, तो ये जो गलवान में हो रहा है, जो हुआ है, ये अपने आप में it's a serious issue. But sometimes you hear people argue that even if you give Kashmir to Pakistan, it will not end the problem for India. Because problem is bigger. Problem is emotional, psychological, historical. They want to teach India a lesson. And they will not be satisfied even if you give them something. They like to do something more. So, hypothetically, again, Galwan is an issue, but it becomes much more complex issue because there is huge other baggage that guides as to how at various levels, whether it is the corps commanders, they have meetings, 18 rounds of talks have happened after Galwan, about half a dozen interministerial meetings. There is a working group on consultation and coordination on China-India border affairs. In fact, in last 3 months, the new Chinese foreign minister and Dr. Jaishankar have met thrice. Again, in multilateral meetings, they have bilateral by the side. So there is so much meetings happening. So there is no dearth of meetings. There is no dearth of desire to come and talk to each other. But very often they are seen talking at each other rather than talking with each other. Because they all have an imagination of being Vishwaguru. Now, if everybody in this room is Vishwaguru, then you can imagine the chaos. So the imagination and perception management. It is very difficult for any of the emerging countries to be seen as on the losing side, making compromise, making accommodation. Everyone, in fact, most of the wars, other than very few rare occasions when war actually ends up in complete decimation of one side. In fact, in last 100 years, most wars end up in what we say, stalemate. They don't have clear victory and defeat. So both sides go home claiming victory. So if I was in Pakistan discussing with students of Pakistan, the narrative there will be they have been victorious in all wars that they fought with India. So everybody goes home saying, I've taught the other side a lesson. So here again, India and China do not find it easy to say, I am willing to give up this territory and let us solve the problem. That is one. Second, even if you think you can give the thing and solve the problem, it's not going to solve the problem because that is not the problem. बुखार हमें होता है, वो बीमारी नहीं, वो सिम्टम है बीमारी का. It tells us something is wrong in the body. So Galwan is a symptom of a problem. And the problem is deeper, of both countries having their self-imaginations as such that it seems to not allow them to have friendship. They are constantly suspicious of each other. They're constantly thinking if India is growing closer to United States, it is definitely to teach China a lesson, to contain China, to put some kind of roadblocks in the rise of China. Whereas Indian establishment will keep trying to explain in media that this has nothing to do with China. That relationship, if you read what Foreign Minister is saying, that India-US relationship, as he says, has been ticking on its own constantly. It has very little to do with China. But it's also hard to believe that it has little to do with China. Because obviously there's a tension with China, and that has led to China-India trade staying around 125 or even less. I think last year it came down to $113 billion. India-US trade is shooting up. It's $190 billion now. So it's almost claiming to be double, twice that of India-China trade. And of course, United States also is emerging as leading defense partner for India, and I think this visit will lead to opening a new chapter of co-production, not just imports. United States, as you know, about 40+% of global exports of defense are from United States. That's a good thing, but that could also be seen as a not so good thing. Because if your earning depends on creating poison and you're selling poison around the world, that could be one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that it is supporting its allies to ensure their national security. It always depends on how you wish to analyze a situation. Now, Russia with Ukraine crisis is becoming less of an attractive supplier of defense technologies. India was constantly depending on Russian defense equipment. It has come down from almost 67% to 47% in last 20 years. It was already reducing. But now Ukraine crisis not only brings down the imagination of Russian technologies, but also their capacity. They have to produce for their own war first. They are not going to give it to others. So whether they are capable of actually, even if they wish to and I wish to take, will they be capable of supplying on time? So number two exporter, Russia, is almost now getting marginalized. France is emerging as the second largest. China, the third largest. Surprise. China also supplies to a lot of what they call appropriate technologies. They are not the most advanced, of course. So this again makes a situation which impacts Galwan. I mean, I can go to nitty-gritties of Galwan if somebody wants, but the bigger picture in which Galwan is located is what I am sharing with you. Galwan is a symptom as much as it is a problem. Yes, good. I love this. Somebody, now I know I am not speaking just monologue, but somebody wants to hear something.
Here I used to consider that India-China relationships can be good if we solve the border problem. I used to think in this way कि अगर एक बार ढंग से border problem solve कर देंगे फिर तुम अपना काम करो हम अपना काम करेंगे. But now you are saying that it is a kind of ego problem. Now we are facing each other at international level. So even if we solve the Galwan problem, even if we solve all the borders, उसके बाद भी problem continuous रहने वाली है.
बिल्कुल यही मेरा अपना मानना है. उसमें फर्क ये है कि जो तनाव सीमा पे है इस वक्त जिसमें आप देख रहे हैं वो तनाव मुश्किल है. यदि खत्म हो भी जाता है, हाइपोथेटिकली मान लीजिए वो खत्म हो जाता है, तो कहीं और दूसरी कोई चीज निकलेगी उसमें, चाहे वो ट्रेड को लेकर हो या कोई दूसरी तरह के हमारे रिश्ते पाकिस्तान से कैसे हैं या नेपाल से कैसे हैं, वियतनाम से कैसे हैं, कोई ना कोई दूसरा बिंदु होगा जहां तनाव बनेगा फिर से. हालांकि सीमा सुलझ जाएगी मुझे लगता नहीं, बहुत मुश्किल काम है. दुनिया की सबसे लंबी उलझी हुई सीमा है ये, लॉन्गेस्ट डिस्प्यूटेड बाउंड्री ऑन द प्लेनेट अर्थ. एंड देन ऑफ कोर्स इट इज not, sometimes I also like to say it is not a boundary problem, it is a problem of territorial sovereignty. The total area is 132,000 square kilometers. The confusion, 38,000 square kilometers in Aksai Chin area, western sector, middle sector around 5,820 or something square kilometers, then 90,000 square kilometers, largest in the eastern sector. So it's almost 2/3 of the size of Nepal. Now, should we call it a boundary problem where there is a little demarcation problem? This is a territorial sovereignty problem. And because both China and India were subjugated by colonial powers, we are obsessed with territoriality. Because we were never a territorial state until we became independent in 47 and 49. And we saw ourselves as territories for the first time. Otherwise, we were idea of India. नीलकणी की किताब है ना एक, आइडिया ऑफ इंडिया. तो टेरिटोरियलिटी से जो ऑब्सेशन है, दैट इज व्हाई यू हैड लैंग्वेज इन 1962-63 until every inch of Indian territory. Now imagine the size of India and China, and then you're talking of territory in inches. That is a preoccupation with जो संप्रभुता है उसका संज्ञान केवल भूमि पर अधिकार पर है. यदि आपको भूमि पर अधिकार है तो आप राष्ट्र हैं, संप्रभु हैं, नहीं तो नहीं है. कॉलोनियल बैकग्राउंड की वजह से तो वो टेरिटरी अपने आप में बहुत उलझी हुई है, बहुत बड़ी है, उसको सुधारना आसान नहीं है. फिर वो टेरिटरी है कैसी? Nobody lives in most of these territories, so there is no history, there is no folklore, there is no songs and music and some other signs of knowing whose cows were grazing and who was collecting taxes in what areas. So these are glaciers, tropical forests, mostly uninhabited. Very few parts of that boundary has habitation. That means it is difficult for either side to prove whose territories were these. And we had frontiers, as I said. So Mir of Hunza, for example, in Kashmir, could pay obeisance to Dalai Lama and could also pay obeisance to Raja of Kashmir. Flexible frontiers. They were not demarcated. So it's very difficult to demarcate. Even you hear an expression, line of actual control. Yeah. So there is line of control with Pakistan because we know where it is, other than minor confusions which are almost intentionally created. Line of actual control is a notional line. There is no line. It's imagined. Alexander Venn talks about imagined communities, right? This is an imagined line. Both have their imagination. It's never delineated. Forget about demarcated. It's demarcated to sambhav lagta nahi. So it's a notional line which is called line of actual control. It was denied by India for long. Nehru, Chow En-lai first used this expression of line of actual control, and Nehru said, this is not acceptable, there is no line of actual control, this territory belongs. In fact, Nehru used to say, we don't have a border problem, because he thought, I know where my border is. In 1993, there was an agreement signed of mutual confidence buildings on the line of actual control in the border regions. That is where line of actual control came to be first coded on a document. But उसी में document में ये भी लिख दिया, they wrote in the same treaty that this would not prejudice the understandings that both sides have on the borders. That what their imaginations are, this word LOAC is not going to impinge on that. Same word was used in 1996 agreement. So this in that sense has become a kind of an acceptable term to say line of actual control. Even on that imagined line of actual control, there are about dozen points on that imagined line where there have been known confusions. Galwan is one of them. 1962 also there is a story about Galwan, if some of you want to read it about it. How Galwan was also central to 1962 eruption. Now let me come to brass tacks. I painted a bigger picture, historical and larger. Let's now come to brass tacks. Even if China and India are buddies, friends, like I pick up two of your best friends from here and say, solve karo. Solve nahi hoga. Because I said it's a territorial sovereignty issue, it's a large territory, there are no records, there is no historical way of In fact, Himalayas, I could even talk geologically, are evolving territory. They are the youngest mountain, they are still forming, so watersheds can move around. So even if I draw a line, I go next year, that river has moved on the other side of line. It's evolving geologically territory. So it's not easy exercise is what I'm saying. Now come to the fact that there are more money in the pocket on both sides. When countries have more money in the pocket, they give it to their citizens. So professors have better salary, doctors make more money, traffic constable who just made some money from us in the bay, we made a wrong U-turn while coming here. So also militaries get more money. So China and India today are world's second largest and third largest defense spenders. Now when you have that kind of resources being made available to your armed forces, then not only their body language changes, when you have more money, your body language is different, right? When you just got a check from home, first week your body language is different. Then second week again body is different because no money. So when you have bigger budgets, you have better infrastructure on both sides. See, China and India are both building. And keep in mind that China is 5 times larger, right? Or even 6 times if you want to exaggerate it. But definitely 5 times larger. So their budget is about much bigger. We are about $70-80 billion. They are about $230-40 billion. So infrastructure on the ground, roads, telecommunications, hospitals, schools, they are both developing now. Smarter villages on the frontiers, you are reading about them. India also, Vibrant Villages India initiative and welfare villages in China's. Some 672 last count, and they must have crossed 700 villages being created like. अब मुझे रोक दीजिएगा जब भी रुकना हो. See, teachers have this habit of going on. मुझे इतने audience मिले हैं ना, तो आज तो एक मैं अपनी बात थोड़ी सी खत्म करूं, फिर आपके पास आऊंगा. Infrastructure has suddenly become much more better. Just like गडकरी जी कहते हैं ना, अभी वो 1.5 घंटे में ऋषिकेश, 2 घंटे में देहरादून, तो बहुत से लोग गाड़ी लेके निकल रहे हैं. तो वैसे इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर बेहतर होने से इक्विपमेंट भी बेहतर है. जो पहले टेंट लगाते थे, अब सेमी परमानेंट फिक्सचर्स कर देते हैं हम. तो ये मोबिलिटी जो है दोनों तरफ से, और चीन की तरफ से ज्यादा, क्योंकि उनके पास ज्यादा पैसे हैं, mobility has increased. So if incursions were happening 200 times earlier, now they are happening 600 times. Incursions meaning, in my judgment, when they have crossed into what I think is my territory. Ingressions or incursions. So more regular, more frequent incursions are happening. More larger, bigger equipment is moving forward. Larger number of forces can be brought forward much faster. And that body language is different, right? Now, if soldiers meet more frequently with greater intensity of angst or anxiety or anger, there is greater likelihood of skirmish, tension, face-off, whatever word you use it. And sometimes you are bound to lose temper. That's what is happening on the border. Without talking of high politics, on the ground, simple things are changing and that are creating certain situations. So therefore you had a new reality where, for example, in 2013 in Chumar, Chinese forces came forward and stayed there for 3 weeks. They would not just meet each other, drop some toffee or chocolate covers or sometimes write a graffiti. They now settled there and it took 3 weeks to get them out. And then you had Doklam, 72 days. And now you had Galwan, last 3 years. Forward posting, forward deployment. So because हैसियत है, sorry. So frequency and intensity and the size of incursions and That itself is leading to tensions. And last point, I'll come to you soon. What happened in April of 2020, for the first time, Chinese incursions of that high intensity magnitude happened in 4 places simultaneously. It had never happened 4 places simultaneously. And then of course it created such a tense situation that people died. Chinese claim only 4 soldiers died. Most of the world believes 40 plus died. 20 soldiers from Indian side also made their supreme sacrifice, as we say. And since then forces are deployed because China with all the neighborhood had a policy of what you keep hearing, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. तो अभी भी वो जितना आगे आए हैं 7 जगह पे 5 से पीछे हट गए हैं, but they have created what is called buffer zones. So I come forward, you go back. I go back and I say, you won't come here anymore. So right now 2 places, Demchok and Depsang, if you are interested, those plains, the last proposal India again rejected, because that is where graziers, all the goat wool business, they graze there and they won't be able to do that now. So India has rejected the last proposal as of now. But 5 places, south of Pangong, we had a huge advantage because India in August of 2020 had moved forward. Bordeaux was now in direct hit of Indian forces on Kala Top and Hat Top. So there is a separate interesting episode going on there. I hope no Chinese is sitting there. Okay, let's go to his question. Use mic. Sir. Why Galwan?
What is the intention of China behind that? And the whole world is facing COVID, and I think in newspaper I read China want to divert from COVID to border issue. This is my question.
Why Galwan happened? I was giving you very innocuous explanations that if you have better infrastructure, frequency of, that face-off increases, sometimes you lose temper. I was making a very monotonous understanding of how it could have happened. But then of course the point he's raising also brings in things like equations between People's Liberation Army and political leadership. Some experts believe that in situations where President Xi Jinping is trying to exert his singular power over the entire country, military, media, masses, all have to be connected to the core of the central leadership of party, which is Xi Jinping. It is sometimes speculated that some people are not happy with that and sometimes they want to create issues. In fact, when last time in 2019 President Xi Jinping was in India, then something on the border had erupted and somebody believed that maybe that was to indicate to Xi Jinping that he is trying to be too pally with the country. The forces are not happy with it. They want to communicate that to him. So there are always insinuations that Galwan could also be a reflection of disjunction between political leadership where they want to go and the military leadership where they want to take the leadership to. But it could also be as well indication from the political leadership. Xi Jinping is known to be a leader who wants to become omnipowerful, as we say. So he... yes, someone has a... Yes, please go ahead.
Jain sir.
Jain.
Is it fruitful to have geosyn sea level talks with China? Like हम already 17-18 times बात कर चुके हैं पर कुछ निकल नहीं रहा है सर उसका.
ये सवाल इतनी देर के बाद आया है, ये अक्सर बहुत जल्दी आता है. Thank you. See, you're sitting far away. I told you to stand up if I don't see you, but good you spoke. ये अक्सर सवाल पूछा जाता है मुझसे भी और बहुत लोगों से, कैन वी ट्रस्ट चाइनीज, है ना? ये मन में आता है कभी कभी, कैन वी ट्रस्ट चाइनीज, और सब लोग ऐसे ऐसे कर रहे हैं. बट यदि मैं चाइनीज क्लास में हूं तो वो मान लीजिए क्या पूछेंगे। एग्जैक्टली, ठीक है। तो ये सवाल जो है वो दोनों तरफ से आ सकता है। और एक अंग्रेज फिलोसोफर कह गए कि इन इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस देयर आर नो फ्रेंड्स एंड एनिमीज, अ परमानेंट इंटरेस्ट, दे गाइड यू व्हाट टू डू विद ईच अदर। सो राइट नाउ फॉर एग्जांपल व्हेन you hear the official line we take is that until border is resolved relations are not normal, but सब कुछ तो नॉर्मल ही है। फॉरेन मिनिस्टर 3 महीने में 3 बार मिले हैं, ट्रेड भी चल रहा है, मैं अगले हफ्ते चीन जा रहा हूँ, वापिस आऊंगा। So yes, I think it's a question which is very interesting. There are always issues of trust, and one has to be careful how much to trust and how much not to trust. And Galwan definitely has undermined that sense of trust, because as he was saying, it happened in middle of pandemic, and many people in the world believe that China was the source of beginning of coronavirus 19, and that it was taking advantage of. India was now getting into lockdown. It was lockdown period, if you remember June. Na? So India was tackling with a situation at home for which many people believe China was responsible, and China was sending these forces moving forward in that difficult time. And that is why India stood up. In fact, entire neighborhood has noticed it very carefully. India is the only country that has stood up and deployed forces which sometimes are estimated either 50,000 or even 120,000, depending on how these calculations are made, which is a huge commitment a nation has to continue that for 3 years. So sometimes we say, since China believes that 2 steps forward, 1 step backward strategy is not very effective with India, they now using another strategy of staying power. Who will blink first? किसके पॉकेट ज़्यादा गहरे हैं, कितने पैसे हैं ज़्यादा, कौन ज़्यादा देर तक। और चाइना में कम्युनिस्ट पार्टी इज ओनली पार्टी कंट्रोलिंग, सो दे डोंट हैव अपोजिशन, दे डोंट हैव मीडिया, they don't have social media. Young people write all kinds of interesting things on young media, so the Chinese don't have to worry about domestic constraints that India sometimes faces. So they think India will blink first and find out some way of resolving and drawing back their forces, but India has so far stood up. So in that sense, yes, 18 rounds of core commanders talks have happened, but let us not also forget that it's not nothing is achieved. I said 5 places disengagement has happened. So starting with Galwan immediately, then in August, I think last year, north and south of Pangong Lake, both sides withdrew, because I said south of Pangong, India had an enormous advantage. So Chinese are happy to achieve that disengagement. And then of course Gogra and Hot Springs, and then yes, there are 2 people I'll take together.
Sir, what is the way forward?
Let the mic come so that last row people can hear, otherwise they'll start different stories.
What is the way forward? For example, चाइना से अगर हम वॉर के लिए जाते हैं तो वो एक इकोनॉमी जो 6 टाइम्स बढ़ गया, और अगर हम पीस की बात करते हैं तो सलामी स्लाइसिंग कर रहे हैं कि आप थोड़ा सा आगे जाओ, फिर वो बफर स्टेट बना देते हैं, फिर हम पीछे आते हैं। तो इंडिया दोनों पोजीशंस में वीक है। What is the way forward for
Way
India?
forward. Let's take his question also. Can somebody pass on that?
Sir. Good afternoon. Sir, from my limited knowledge, I used to think that the main reason behind the conflict of India-China is natural resources or ideological hegemony. Like Sang River, China can utilize only 20 to 30% of water. In India, Brahmaputra, India used to 40 to 50%. But now, sir, I'm very confused that if I'll have to summarize 4 to 5 points, like what is the main conflict or main reason of conflict behind India and China relation? Sir, what was the...
Okay.
So as Galwan issue is concerned, sir, do you come up with this conclusion that the role of contention is not only because of the frontier issues, but also because of the overlying interest in the economic forum?
Yeah, sure. I think एक यहाँ स्टूडेंट ने बहुत अच्छा कहा था, ईगो प्रॉब्लम है, किसी ने कहा था इधर से, हाँ आपने कहा था कि ईगो का प्रॉब्लम है। तो बहुत साधारण तौर पे इसको कहा जाए तो बहुत ही कैरिकेचर या स्टीरियोटाइप कर दें तो हाँ कह सकते हैं कि ईगो का भी शायद प्रॉब्लम है ये। हालांकि उतना आसान नहीं है उसको समझना। इट्स नॉट जस्ट सिंपल ईगो इशू, देयर आर डीपर कंटेंशंस दैट बोथ हैव। आई विल कम टू, यू हैव सीन योर हैंड। तो पहले तो वे फॉरवर्ड क्या है यहाँ? वे फॉरवर्ड मुझे लगता है हाउ टू मैनेज दैट रिलेशनशिप, बिकॉज we are not just the largest population countries, we are fastest growing economies, largest defense spenders, nuclear weapon states. So managing the problem, I think managing our irritants such that, कभी कभी मैं कहता हूँ लाइफ इज अ पैकेज डील ना, उसमें ऐसा नहीं कि सब कुछ अच्छा ही होना है, बट इज योर पैकेज डील हैवी ऑन द पॉजिटिव साइड और हैवी ऑन द नेगेटिव साइड? I didn't say that. क्योंकि मुझे अभी बॉर्डर क्रॉस करना है। So there are multiple pulls and pressures on both sides in that sense. Economic rise is an issue.
Some time ago, China claimed for some part of Arunachal Pradesh territory.
जी.
Sir, it is happened by the Brahmaputra water reserve, and if not, sir, what reason might be behind it? It is pointed.
Water is very significant element of bilateral relations because there is a major river which when it enters India it is called Brahmaputra, Sangpo when it is in Tibet. In 1994 there was a scholar Thomas Homer Dixon. He gave a thesis saying that all future wars will be driven and triggered by resources, resource conflict. All conflicts, wars will be driven by resources, and he talked about resource shrink because of population growths. Consumptions will go up and therefore resources will become less and there will be fight for resources. Water, he said, is one of the important. In fact, there is a whole school of thought called hydrohegemony. Hydropolitics भी शायद आपने सुना होगा. So, water is a very important source for any rapidly developing. जैसे एनर्जी की बात करते हैं ना, पेट्रोलियम की हम इंपोर्ट करते हैं. We are so much dependent on imported oil and gas. But imagine all of us can survive much longer without oil and gas. We can survive much lesser time if there is no water. So that water sharing between China and India has been an issue. There are all kinds of suspicions of China building dams. There was also theories about, speculations about China trying to divert, that Sangpo river to add it to other rivers in China. So yes, that's a issue between China and India, but I am underlining repeatedly, these are symptoms of something basic, something deeper. That is the contestation or competition that these two countries will inevitably throw up to each other, because they are both similar size population, developing countries. China is ahead of us, but it calls it a developing country. Yes.
Sir, I have a quite general question. Sir, which strategy benefits the most, either zero-sum game or a non-zero-sum game?
Zero-sum game is a quite dated and crude way of handling relationship. And zero-sum game sometimes is not very exact way of understanding equations. No relationship can be completely zero-sum. It's not that your loss is your friend's gain 100%. You may be either losing more and he gaining less, or you may be losing less and he gains more. So zero-sum imagines that my gain is my enemy's loss and my enemy's gain is my loss. And that is a crude way of understanding a relationship, particularly in today's world when we are so connected with each other. World is so deeply interconnected is what has made China such an influential player. Because unlike 19th, 20th century great powers that depended on military naval bases, military power, wars to become influential, Chinese didn't do that. Chinese used economic relationship. They improved trade and sometimes only one-sided trade, and then to huge investments. You have heard Belt and Road Initiative. They are going around the world building mega structures, big things for everybody. So Chinese learned this new trick that if you make other countries interdependent with you, then they are less likely to do things to destroy you, because in China's destruction is everybody else's destruction. So let us say China breaks into 20 pieces tomorrow and becomes a sort of bankrupt economy. Imagine how much rest of the world get impacted. For 15 years, China is the world's largest trading country. Other than about a dozen countries, all countries have China as their largest trading partner, not United States. So it built itself in such a fashion that most nations see their prosperity connected to Chinese prosperity. So even with India, for example, there's a huge e-commerce, a huge amount of infrastructure building in which Chinese companies are involved. Not just social media, which of course we banned many apps. So Chinese tried new methodology, and what made new methodology work very well, because the whole world was shifting away from core focus on military strength. When we talk of power in international relations, it surrounds around military power. That is the core. You have to be a very strong military power. But you have heard this name of Joseph Nye. He's been talking about soft power, smart power, sharp power. So power can be utilized in many other ways. That is why Vishwaguru, that is also soft power. If I can convince others to work for me without putting gun on their head, that is a better method. So the whole world was shifting away from, because of 2 world wars partly, but overall world was shifting from too much focus on just military power to what we call comprehensive national strength, and Chinese focused on comprehensive national strength. So sometime I say in 70s, when Germany became a great economic success story, or Japan became a great success story as an economy, they were not called superpowers, or they were not called great powers, because at that time focus was totally on nuclear weapons. We used to see movies like Nuclear Armageddon. We had doctrines like mutual destruction, mutual assured destruction doctrines. So nuclear weapons was only main source of power, and if you were also prosperous society, that's okay, but that doesn't make you a great influential power. But by the time discourse shifted to comprehensive national strength, we started shifting from geostrategic to geoeconomics as the determining factor. So geopolitics guides India, for example, to become part of Quad, but geoeconomics also makes us part of BRICS. So as this drift was happening from geostrategic military focus to geoeconomic focus, economic power became an important component, not the sole component, but the important component of what makes a country influential. And that is the moment from 1990s, China was growing as a great, bigger economy. And they started using that by building trade and by building investments. So now, after 10 years of Belt and Road Initiative, Xi Jinping is announcing more grandiose ideas, what he calls Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative. So he's now building on that economic interdependence that has been built over years to emerge as a very, very influential power. And there are estimates that by 2030, when India is supposed to be third largest economy by crossing Germany and Japan, China would have crossed United States and become world's largest economy. Effort in United States case is to make sure that China does not become larger economy than United States. That is why it is trying to deny China technologies, semiconductors particularly. Yes, please.
Sir, what China gains from following the policy of salami slicing, no country now do it nowadays, and they can do the same by using the soft power, not by this hard power technique.
Let me take the other one also. Yes, please. हाँ, इनको दे दीजिए माइक.
In Dr. Kanwar Chema's show, you talked about the Indo-Chinese relationship, Indian-Chinese relationship with respect to growing India-US relationship with the White House towards the most consequential relationship in the era. So, what is the effect of Indian-US relationship with the India-Chinese relationship with the opening of NATO Plus and right now MQ-9 Predator drones and these type of technologies? What will be the effect on the Indian-Chinese relationship?
I think let's take his one more question.
Also, sir, good afternoon to you. Sir, we know that there exists a long issue in China and with India also of Tibet. Tibetan factor is also there. So, sir, according to you, what impacts does this Tibetan independence movement made here and also in the relation between India and China? And can it be a road ahead for the solution?
Tibet is a very important lever or a card that India has. Because Tibet is a very, not just strategic issue, it is a strategic issue, but it's also a very emotional issue in China. And we have the most revered Tibetan leader here in India. We have government in exile. And we have 100,000 officially Tibetans as refugees in India. But it also depends on when and how one wishes to use that card. How capable one is of using that card. So when from, let me just finish. When from early 90s we started talking directly to Chinese leaders, then the Tibet issue became relatively sidelined. It was not used very often to put China in sort of a certain bad light or use that card as much as we could have used. So in that sense, yes, Tibet is a card which can be used, but it's not being used because India is talking directly to Chinese leaders. But you would remember, as and when India wants to use, it can. So during last 3 years of tensions, there are indications that the Tibet card is again in display. We had something called Establishment 22, which is later also called Special Frontier Force. Special Frontier Force became little more visible now in last 3 years. India has several, I think about a dozen special forces, meant for very different things. Some are meant for frontier areas, some are meant for sandalwood thieves in southern India, someone is meant for Prime Minister's security. There are many special forces we have. And one special force was the one we are talking of, Special Frontier Force, largely constitutive of Tibetans, refugees in India, and later some, I think Nepalese also into it, which primarily was to deal with China, but they also contributed to all other wars of India. For example, even in Kargil war, they had a role. So this was kind of a covert force, and lately has kind of come into light. One of their soldiers who died in his funeral, one of the BJP leader had attended, and then of course that tweet was removed, etc. So relatively more visibility. Let me take one or two questions. Yes, please.
सर जैसे चाइना काफी हेल्पफुल रहा है पाकिस्तान के लिए.
एक मिनट, जिसके पास माइक है उसको बोलने दीजिए. हाँ, माइक किनके पास है वो बोले प्लीज. यस
सर, चाइना काफी जैसे प्रोजेक्ट्स वगैरह में पाकिस्तान का हेल्प किए जा रहा है, तो पर वो प्रोजेक्ट्स इंडिया के लिए कुछ इश्यू क्रिएट कर रहे हैं. तो सर अगर एक पल को मान लिया जाता है कि हिंदुस्तान चाइना के रिलेशन इंप्रूव हो जाते हैं, तो क्या चाइना पाकिस्तान के साथ जो संबंध है उनको कुछ कम करेगा हिंदुस्तान को खुश करने के लिए? और वहीं अगर यूएस को देखते हैं जो हमेशा चाइना को काउंटर करना चाहता है, तो क्या इंडिया चाइना के गहरे संबंधों को देखकर यूएस का क्या स्टैंस रहेगा? क्या वो पाकिस्तान को फिर से पहले जैसे सपोर्ट करेगा या नहीं?
सबसे पहले तो राष्ट्रों में, देशों में आपसी संबंध कभी भी ऐसे नहीं होते हैं जो बहुत अच्छे दोस्त हैं, जैसे ब्रिटेन और अमेरिका. देशों में हमेशा कुछ ना कुछ मुद्दे अड़चन वाले, इरिटेशन वाले हमेशा रहते हैं. तो मान लीजिए कि हाइपोथेटिकली आपने कहा कि भारत और चीन के संबंध अच्छे हो जाएं, तो क्या वो चीन पाकिस्तान से अपना पल्लू छुड़ाने लगेगा जब कुछ अपने रिश्तों में बदलाव लाएगा? ला सकता है, भारत को खुश करने के लिए कर सकता है ये। ठीक उसका उल्टा आज हो रहा है। पाकिस्तान की जीडीपी अभी तो शायद और कम हो गई होगी, पर मैंने जब लास्ट पढ़ी तो करीब 280-90 बिलियन डॉलर थी, और चीन 65 बिलियन डॉलर के इन्वेस्टमेंट कर रहा है। मान लीजिए आपका मंथली जो पेरेंट भेजते हैं आपको 10,000 है और आपने मुझसे 11,000 कर्जा लिया है, तो वो मतलब कर्जा देने वाला पुनर्जन्म में विश्वास रखने वाला होना चाहिए कि अभी नहीं तो अगले जन्म में। तो चीन का जो निवेश पाकिस्तान में है उसका केवल सामरिक एक्सप्लेनेशन है, आर्थिक कोई उसका एक्सप्लेनेशन नहीं है, क्योंकि वो कभी भी हैसियत में शायद नहीं होगा कि वो वापस दे पाए कर्जा अपना। तो चीन इतना निवेश क्यों कर रहा है पाकिस्तान में ना? क्योंकि पाकिस्तान पर अपना पूरी तरह से प्रभाव बनाए रखना चाहता है। बड़ी मजेदार बात यह है कि वो शायद बहुत एक अकेली उदाहरण है जब चीन या कोई एक देश दूसरे देश में निवेश करता है और उस देश को कहता है कि 15,000 की फौज खड़ी करें ताकि जो मैं निवेश कर रहा हूँ वो साजो सामान और मेरे जो इंजीनियर्स हैं वो सेफ रहे। तो यदि आपको इतना ही भरोसा है अपने दोस्त के ऊपर, तो फिर आप निवेश क्यों कर रहे हैं? और उसके बावजूद अक्सर ऐसा होता है कि चीनी इंजीनियर उड़ जाते हैं, ले जाते हैं, बम फटते हैं, ये होता है। तो उसका सामरिक वजह है कि चीन इस क्षेत्र में पूरी तरह से अपना प्रभाव बनाना चाहता है, उसको अफगानिस्तान के साथ जोड़ता है, वहाँ उसको कॉपर नज़र आता है। तो चीन के अपने कारण हैं, और चीन को ये भी तो पता है ना कि जो ज़्यादातर दुनिया के मुल्क हैं, मोस्ट ऑफ द कंट्रीज हैव इन्वेस्टमेंट्स फ्रॉम डेवलप्ड वेस्टर्न नेशंस, G7 countries, European countries, partly because of colonial connections, partly also because they are advanced in technology. So China can only invest in other countries where these countries have no reach. So therefore China के हिस्से अक्सर वो कंबोडिया, लाओस, अफगानिस्तान आते हैं। हालांकि धीरे धीरे यूरोप में भी उसका इन्वेस्टमेंट होना शुरू हो गया। शायद कोई और कुछ कहना चाह रहे थे। जी
सर, गुड इवनिंग सर। सर
अच्छा, आफ्टरनून से इवनिंग हो गया। आफ्टरनून से इवनिंग हो गया अभी।
सर, विल चाइना इन्वेड ताइवान, and if it does, what should be India's response to that? And in case China gets involved in a conflict with India, will that not necessarily translate into a two-front war with Pakistan and China of India? And if a two-front war happens, is India prepared for that?
There are two questions here. One is if Taiwan is invaded, how will India react? My sense is it will be foolish, counterproductive, dangerous idea for China to invade Taiwan, and I don't think any sensible Chinese is thinking of doing it, because that will put the entire world together against the Chinese, because China has already rattled much of the powerful countries around the world, and they will need an excuse to teach China a lesson. So it's counterproductive. In any case, Chinese don't want it. What Chinese want is enormous economic connections with Taiwan. Taiwan is a very advanced economy. They are leading production of semiconductors. So Chinese would not like to destroy that golden goose that gives golden egg. So they have enormous intersocietal relationship. There are two political parties, main political parties in Taiwan, DPP and Kuomintang. When Kuomintang Nationalist Party comes to power, they are relatively softer on China. When DPP comes to power, they are relatively trying to push towards autonomy. Meanwhile, 8 year cycle चल रहा है इन दो political parties का। Kuomintang आ सकता है, Kuomintang, but कुछ लोग कहते हैं नहीं, DPP फिर आएगा। But ये सब के चलते क्या हो रहा है, धीरे धीरे दुनिया में अब केवल 13 छोटे छोटे देश बचे हैं जो ताइवान को मान्यता देते हैं कि वो एक nation state है. Only 13 countries today recognize Taiwan as a nation state. So China's effort will be over a period of time 0 countries recognize Taiwan. So if that becomes a reality, Chinese will have to do nothing, because if 0 countries recognize Taiwan as a nation state, Meanwhile, China is trying that Taiwan doesn't become part of any international organizations. For example, WHO में उसको नहीं जाने दिया. So that kind of strategy is what China is aiming at. But yes, there is a possibility of tensions erupting. For example, when last year in August, American House Speaker Nancy Pelosi paid a sudden 3-hour visit there or something like that. Suddenly tensions cropped and a lot of military exercises happened at that time. So tensions can happen, mistake can happen, but I don't see Taiwan militarily being taken over by Chinese. Second question you had was, I forgot what was your second question.
India capable of two-front.
Oh, two-front wars. Again, same answer. Yeah, I remembered your question. Ma'am has helped me to remember your question. I don't think again it makes any sense for either China or India or Pakistan to go into war, because these are going to be completely counterproductive. Particularly China and India are on growth trajectories, and war will push them at least several years or decades. We don't know what kind of war will happen. It is also possible because they have many other levers to arm twist each other. Why will they use the crude weapon of an actual full-scale big war? Galwan, in my assessment, was an aberration. I don't think either side wanted to go that far, but it just happened. It can happen. I always also say, I just told you, China is second largest, India is third largest defense spender. There are large armies, nuclear weapon powers. Always you see skirmishes on the border are pushing and shoving, stone pelting, iron rods. That looks like some 16th century armies fighting with each other. But underline that there is enormous restraint involved in doing that, because both sides understand they cannot afford to fight a war. It is not that they are not capable, they are quite capable, but they intentionally, it's like you keep pushing some guy and he doesn't respond to you. It's not necessarily that he's not capable of fighting, he just chooses not to fight with you. It's not good time for him. He will choose his time. So both sides have also intentionally maintained a very strong sense of control and not letting things go out of hand. To me that is a sign that China and India don't want to fight a big war. Because when you fight a big war, the military industrial complex of developed countries will become richer. Sometimes you see when Middle East suddenly found oil, they also found a lot of conflicts with each other. Is there a correlation? You heard something called petrodollars term? So now India is making money. Are we going to get into also a lot of conflicts? We should avoid. Learn from others. We are not going to spend all our money on buying weapons. We have other things to do. Educate young children, make them more productive, become second, third largest economy if possible. So I think there is, if one has to be devil's advocate, possibility of something like that, but I don't see not even a single front full-scale war happening. Forget about two-front war. Of course, armed forces are paid to think of worst-case scenarios. Armed forces have to be prepared for worst-case scenarios. So I'm sure army leadership is keeping in mind how to deal with two-front warfare, even 2.5-front warfare if you include internal crisis. So armies are of course trained and prepared to deal with that. But as an academic, I don't think that's a very, very possible scenario.
Good evening, sir. Jayan.
Yes, Jayan.
Sir, I would like to ask two questions, sir. First, sir, don't you think, sir, that India should drop its plans of multi-alignment or non-alignment system and should get along with America and other NATO members? And along with that, sir, why in spite of talking so much about trade deficit and all, we are seeing always the rise of the trade between India and China, on which India is always on a losing side, sir. So what are the solutions to these problems?
Yes. First, about giving up multilateralism. I think to some extent multilateralism is India's DNA. You can't shed easily. Why? Because You have heard about unity in diversity mantra? Because we are so diverse ourselves. We are so used to, in this room I am sure there are about 25 languages that people can speak, or maybe more. And it doesn't disturb you if somebody in the back row is talking in Tamil and somebody next door is talking in Bengali. It doesn't disturb us at all. We are so comfortable with that. We are used to it. Because we have seen, we have lived in that reality of multicultural, multi-ethnicity, multilingual, multi-religion, everything multi. So therefore with multilateralism we are perfectly at home. Some other country without naming may not be comfortable because they are monolithic. They are only Han Chinese. So India in fact feels much at home in multilateralism, and therefore is not seen inclined to join. And in fact, if you keep hearing again, we have a very articulate foreign minister now. He says we are world's largest population country, 5th largest economy, ancient civilization continuing. We don't have to join any grouping. We are our own group. We are as big as a group and we can make our own groups. So we have moved now from non-alignment to multi-alignments in terms of building relationships and partnerships with as many countries as possible in as many sectors. Interesting example I always give is Middle East. In Middle East, countries that don't talk to each other talk to India. Iran, Israel, UAE, Saudi Arabia, they are all engaged with India. That is how when President Joe Biden wanted to create a second Quad, after Indo-Pacific Quad, he created a West Asian Quad. He put India into it. India is not a Middle Eastern country, but he saw that India is a country that everyone in the Middle East talks to. So I think multilateralism is very integral to us. Multipolarism is power driven, multilateralism is norm driven. And then there is something called minilateralism, which is fixed period, objective driven. 6-party talks like. So I don't think India is kind of joining either G7. We are always invited to G7. Indian Prime Minister is always invited to G7. He sits there. Now India is president of G20. Yes, please. Trade deficit is a bad thing because, as I said, एक तरफा व्यापार चलता नहीं है. But apparently Chinese have not helped us because Chinese have to open up and create more opportunities for Indian exports to be absorbed in China so that trade can be more balanced between two sides. It hasn't happened. Some people might say India has to become more competitive also. But sometimes also economists tell you that buyer is doing a favor to the seller, because otherwise that is going to become overproduction if consumption doesn't happen. And Chinese need to understand that if India is importing so much more from China, they should also create possibilities for Indian exports to China. It hasn't happened in 15 years. They tried other strategies. You remember Prime Minister Modi had started informal summit meetings with Xi Jinping and started opening India to investment, saying that if Chinese begin to come and produce in India, that will do two things. Reduce the reason for India to import because now it's being produced locally. Second, make India more competitive in exporting. So a lot of phone companies came and started producing in India. One Chinese automobile factory was supposed to open in Gujarat. So that effort was also made, but then we got into pandemic and Galwan, which is the talk today, which again has kind of put this whole new initiative, new way of thinking in a cold storage. There was also this whole thinking of 2+1, that China and India together will invest in third countries, which also because of this Galwan issue is now not being engaged very seriously. Yes, yes.
I can see your enthusiasm, but I want that we should hear Sir more, because maybe he wants something, he has something very special in his store, certain ideas which we should not miss. So the questions will keep on happening, but I would like to let us, Sir should take the lead and let us know. And also, like, if you can give insight for these students that in future, what should be the relevant questions we should be asking in sense what are the things we should be looking for if we are trying to understand India-China relations. What are the areas we should not miss the sight? Fine. And sir, I think we would like to hear more from you now.
Okay. But with your permission, I think these two can say, and then I'll speak a little longer.
That China want to be a global power, so America considered themselves as their competitor. And we are seeing the rising influence of China everywhere in the world, like in Indo-Pacific, in Middle East. So in the Indo-Pacific, we call the term like string of pearls. Sir, but there are some strategic interests of China also in that region and in Middle East also. Now we have seen that China was negotiating the peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they have recently met with the Palestinian Prime Minister.
Got your question.
So sir, I want to know that is China a real threat to India? Like you said, we don't want to go in a war sense. And sir, if the question come in exam about the rising influence of China in the world, what kind of answer we should write? Should we counter the rising influence of China, what we are doing? What kind of answer we should write in the exam if it's come?
Okay, I think there was one more question.
The former Foreign Secretary Shubhra Ranjan said that India is receding in China's rearview mirror. Sir, aren't we lacking the fundamental unit of development? That is the human resource. पहले चाइना ने अपने ह्यूमन रिसोर्स पे डेवलपमेंट किया, वही उसी के कारण उनका मैन्युफैक्चरिंग हमारे से 4 टाइम्स ज़्यादा है. उनका एजुकेशन फॉरेन इंस्टीट्यूशन उसमें आते हैं, हमारा फॉरेन इंस्टीट्यूशन मतलब हमारे इंडिया में फॉरेन इंस्टीट्यूशन नहीं आते, इवन स्टूडेंट्स अब्रॉड जाते हैं. वहीं अगर हम बात करें सर फार्मास्यूटिकल्स के सेक्टर में भी, तो इंडिया इज दो लीडिंग, बट वहीं काफ़ी केसेस आ जाते हैं, रिसेंटली न्यूज़ में भी था. तो और आपने सर एग्जांपल दिया यूएस एंड यूके के रिलेशनशिप का, तो विल इंडिया एंड चाइना एवर सेट दिस एग्जांपल, एंड इफ नॉट देन व्हाई, एंड इफ यस देन हाउ?
Very difficult objective type questions. Let me just say a few things now. I think Shubhra ji is asking me to say what are the areas you should be carefully watching, looking, that are interesting for you to look at. Broadly, no, I think broadly you notice that India is growing closer to United States, right? So that is a relationship to watch. And how far that is driven by China, how is China viewing that relationship? Because Chinese are very carefully, meticulously watching what India is doing with the United States. What are the new equipment India is buying? For example, we are now buying drones, for example, or buying UAVs from the United States. So what is the kind of technology that is coming to India, whether it is a license production or it is a technology transfer, it is a sharing of blueprints of technology, or it is only giving spare parts to assemble? And how is India building what is called Atmanirbhar Bharat, Make in India ideas? You see this whole list expanding, almost 800 plus items now which are not going to be imported, is what Defense Ministry has put a list now. Now, what are these technologies which are going to be produced locally, and are they going to be kind of blended with technologies that are coming from abroad? Because idea of Make in India is to shift from Make in India to Made in India, just like Chinese did. Chinese first were producing for everybody else, and then they started producing their own competitive brands. In fact, the entire problem that United States has with China is this: as long as China was producing, manufacturing things for United States, and United States without providing labor, land, electricity, all inputs into that production, they were just designing things there, Chinese were producing, and Americans were making profit. That arrangement was fantastic, and that made China such a big economy. And then China started producing its own brands. Now, when these brands start competing with European and American brands, that is where the clash begins. So that is why America wants to deny China advanced technologies, access to advanced technologies. In fact, the same thing was happening during Cold War. There was something called COCOM, which was supposed to deny Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc advanced technologies from Western countries. So West and United States thinks they are at the frontiers of technology and they can provide access or deny that technology depending on whether they see you as an adversary or partner. India has not become an alliance partner, but India is quite a close partner. Our major defense partner, India is called. But even with India, US has been very cautious in transferring technologies. Now there is a talk of joint production of engines, aviation engines. That could be the beginning of co-production. Whether that is going to be licensed production like Soviet production in India, or it's going to be technology transfers, that is also going to be seen. And how that shift of India, by standing on its feet, staying neutral in Ukraine crisis, staying vocal about not listening to United States and buying oil from Russia, and still growing the proximity with United States on its own terms, how is that impacting the relationship with China? How is that impacting relationship with Pakistan? For example, Pakistan has already become less attractive for United States. United States doesn't see Pakistan as a very reliable or desirable ally anymore, because relationship with India has completely transformed. And therefore, in fact, India was always the first choice for America in South Asia, but because we stood non-aligned and we said we will not be aligning with anyone and we'll have our own non-aligned movement, is why America had to choose Pakistan and make Pakistan part of what was called Baghdad Pact and later called CENTO, Central Treaty Organization. But those treaties did not work. So look at sometime interesting comparisons of how after Second World War, United States created NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to handle Soviet Union's threat in Europe, but also created CETO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, and CENTO, so deal with Southeast Asia and West Asia, led by United States military alliance. But CETO, CENTO did not function because these regions were not all Christian societies. Middle East to some extent was still cohesive but not Christian. Southeast Asia was completely whole range of religions and cultures. So that military alliances did not work. So United States instead did two things. One is called hub and spokes, which means signed bilateral alliances with Korea, Japan, Philippines, which were hubs in crisis situation, could involve other friendly countries as well into it, hub and spokes. Second was, this was hard balancing of threat in East, which is China, Soviet Union in Europe, NATO, CETO, Center for China. Soft balancing happened through ASEAN. ASEAN was created to soft balance containing communism spread in the region. Now same ASEAN during the East Asian financial crisis saw China as the first country that came to rescue. And thereafter China has become much closer and friendlier to ASEAN. So ASEAN therefore doesn't serve American purpose of being a strong counterbalance to China. Despite all the claims and clashes in South China Sea that some of the four Southeast Asian countries have claims on South China Sea that China denies that they don't have. Despite that, the ASEAN has never stood up together against China. In fact, ASEAN has China as the largest trading partner now. So once ASEAN is no longer what we say the bulwark of United States to counter China in the region, they have started now creating quadrilateral security framework. So instead of having smaller 10 countries working together as a collective to deal with China, they now have 4 major countries coming together: Australia, Japan, India and United States, creating Quad to deal with restraint on China. Now India is the only country which is not alliance partner in quadrilateral security framework. Australia and Japan are alliance partners of United States. ANZUS treaty, New Zealand, US, Australia. And India was not comfortable in what, there are two documents to understand India's approach to Indo-Pacific. Whether Indo-Pacific formulation will contain China or not. One is the Shangri-La dialogue speech of Prime Minister June 1st, 2018. And last year in September there was a speech in Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok by Foreign Minister. These are two documents. Fundamentally, India said two things. One, we will not see, or we will make sure that Indo-Pacific does not become militarized. That was a clear indication to United States, Australia and Japan that Quad will not be militarized. Pompeo, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, was very determined to make a Quad into a military kind of a platform. Chinese used to call this as becoming Asian NATO. India never was comfortable in turning Quad into Asian NATO. So therefore, September last year, Joe Biden started another initiative called AUKUS, Australia, UK, US. That is now handling the military posturing, submarines and other technologies. Quad is only doing non-traditional security at best, but other than that, critical technologies, climate change, pandemics, this is what Quad is doing, because India wanted not to turn Quad into a military organization. So in that sense, India's standing up to certain issues has been over a period of time accepted by other countries in that sense. So India in that sense is engaging United States on its own terms. You have to understand that India is not being pushed by China. That's one element. But also India is not changing its policies just because United States will do some, will carry some favor to us in that sense. And that is the kind of new India, confident India, that with all its flaws, I'm not saying there are no issues, there are no problems, there are challenges, a lot of challenges in the country. But if you look at the bigger picture, how is India seen as a country as a whole? There is definitely much more visibility that India now has. Whenever you travel even to smallest countries now around the world, you don't have to tell where is India, what is India. Most people around the world now are aware of India. India is also now being repeatedly highlighted as the fastest growing economy among the G20 nations. India is pushing now to make Africa join the G20. That is what is going to be India's contribution to G20 structure. Add Africa, because yes, Africa is another, you should also be carefully looking at Africa. Africa is going to be the growth story of 20th century. Second half of 20th century, if you find a job in Africa, go there. That's where all the money is going to be. 2050 onwards, the growth story of the world is going to be led by African countries, because demographic trends are such. They will have young populations. India now has the young demographic dividend. That's why India is growing faster, because young people are productive, ambitious, aspiring young people, as we say. So Africa is what China has already engaged very seriously. China is all over Africa. You go to several countries in Africa, at the airport you will see Ethiopian language and Chinese language, no English. So either you have to know Chinese or Ethiopian. So they've been building infrastructure there are about 1 million Chinese across Africa now, working on various projects. India has also had a traditional link with South Africa, whether it is Gandhi or it is Indian diaspora across. Indian diaspora is all over Africa. In some countries they are the business moguls, they are the big business people, Guptas in Kenya, for example. So India also now is understanding the game plan and is linking increasingly with Africa. And this is an important initiative Prime Minister is taking to get Africa into G20. So look at Africa as a possible growth story. How is India engaging with Africa? So I think I should stop here. I get an understanding. You have other things to attend to. My best wishes to all of you. So sometime next year we will know which were the 100 out of you or more who made it into the final list. Best wishes to you.